Everyone at the firm called me lucky. Lucky to have caught the attention of a Whitmore. Lucky to have a corner office on the 32nd floor, a ring that cost more than my parents' house, and a mother-in-law who sent me fresh flowers every Monday morning without fail. What they didn't know was that those flowers always came with a card. And the cards always said the same thing in her perfect copperplate handwriting. Representing the family well today? I kept every single one of them. In a shoebox. Under the bed. Evidence. My name is Serena, and for 3 years I was the most envied woman in my zip code. I was also the most surveilled, the most corrected, and the most silently threatened. My mother-in-law, Irene, ran the Whitmore family the way a general runs a war zone, with total information control and zero tolerance for dissent. My husband, Garrett, was her eldest son and her most prized asset, which meant I was, by extension, an acquisition she hadn't approved. She never said it outright. That wasn't her style. She said things like, "Serena, that dress reads a little junior for a Whitmore event, don't you think?" She said, "Garrett mentioned you grew up in Dayton. How wonderful that you've adapted so quickly." She said it with a smile that never reached her eyes, surrounded by people who laughed on cue. And I was supposed to smile back and say nothing because that was what you did when you married into a family like this one. I did it for 2 years and 11 months. Then, I stopped. The night everything broke open was a Thursday in November. Garrett's firm, the Whitmore Group Commercial Real Estate, 3 generations of old money and new lawsuits, was hosting its annual fundraiser at the St. Regis in Midtown. Black tie, open bar, 200 guests who all knew each other and had spent decades deciding where people like me belonged. I had been at the office until 6. I drove home, showered, and stood in front of my closet for a long time. Irene had sent a dress. She did this for every major event. A package would arrive 2 days before with a note that said something like, "Thought this might suit the occasion," and inside would be something beige. Something that made me look like I was trying to disappear. I left it in the box. I wore the dress I had bought for myself in September. Navy, structured shoulders, cut clean and sharp at the knee. I kept it on its hanger for 2 months, waiting for the right moment. When I walked into the lobby of the St. Regis, Garrett turned and looked at me the way he used to look at me before his mother learned my name, and for exactly 4 seconds I remembered why I had said yes. Then Irene appeared behind his left shoulder, and his expression went neutral. "You look cold," she said. By way of greeting, Garrett said nothing. I smiled. "I'm comfortable, thanks." We moved into the event. The room was gilded and loud and full of people air-kissing over champagne, and I played my part. I introduced myself to the right people. I laughed at the right moments. I found my seat, which Irene had arranged so that I was placed between 2 of her friends at the far end of the table, nowhere near my husband. I had learned to notice things like that. What I hadn't told anyone, not my sister, not my closest friend from law school, not even my therapist, because some things you hold so close they become structural, was that 6 months earlier I had gone looking for something. Garrett had been off. Not in an obvious way. In a slow, quiet way that I initially blamed on stress, and then on me, and then, finally, on something else entirely. He would lose the thread of a conversation mid-sentence. He would come home from dinners with his mother and sleep for 11 hours. He would forget things we had talked about the day before. Important things. Things about us. His doctor, a physician Irene had chosen, who shared an office building with the Whitmore Group's accountants, told him it was burnout, recommended a supplement protocol. Garrett took it faithfully every morning. I started researching the supplements 6 months ago on a Tuesday night when Garrett was asleep by 8:30, and I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that he hadn't been able to remember our anniversary. 2 of the compounds in combination had documented effects on short-term memory and motivation suppression. They weren't illegal. They weren't even particularly obscure. But the dosage that would produce what I was watching unfold in my own home was not something a responsible physician would recommend to a healthy 36-year-old man. I didn't go to Garrett. I knew what would happen if I did. He would bring it to his mother. His mother would handle it. I would become the paranoid, controlling wife who didn't trust the family doctor. And 3 months later, I would be signing divorce papers in an office where every person in the room had been hired by Irene. So I went somewhere else. I went to the SEC. I had been a securities attorney for 4 years before I left the firm to join Garrett's company in a role Irene had described as a natural fit for someone with your background, by which she meant she wanted me where she could watch me. What she didn't anticipate was that watching meant I also got to watch. In 18 months, I had accumulated documentation of investment irregularities in 3 Whitmore Group funds that would have made my old colleagues' heads spin. I'd been sitting on it trying to decide what to do, feeling like a woman holding a live wire. The supplement research made the decision for me. I met with an agent named Pollard twice at a coffee shop near Penn Station, and I handed over copies of everything. He was careful and slow and took very thorough notes. He told me the timeline would not be fast. He told me I should continue acting normally. He told me not to discuss it with anyone, including my husband, until they had completed their review. I asked him if I could have one signal, one thing I could do, in a room full of people, that would tell him it was time. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said yes. That was October. The fundraiser was November. I had been patient for 6 months. I could be patient for one more evening. The dinner was interminable in the way that those events always are. 4 courses designed to make you feel grateful. Remarks from the firm's senior partners. A live auction for a ski chalet in Vail that went for $240,000, while waiters refilled wine glasses with practiced invisibility. I ate. I made conversation. I watched Garrett across the table, laughing at something one of his partners said, and I thought about the man I had married before his mother got the dosage right. If you were sitting in my chair, knowing what I knew, watching what I was watching, would you have gotten up and walked out? I thought about it. Every day for 6 months I thought about it, but walking out meant leaving him in it, and I had made a decision about that a long time ago. The auction ended, the band started. People began to move around the room the way they do at the end of formal dinners, gravitational and slightly loosened by wine. Irene found me near the bar. She was wearing ivory, which she always did at events where I might be wearing color, and her hair was set in a style that had not changed in 30 years. She had a way of positioning herself that made any conversation feel like a performance review. I noticed you didn't wear the dress I sent, she said. I had something already planned. She looked at my neckline. You do like to make a statement, don't you? It wasn't a question. She said it the way you say something that means something else. And behind her, 2 of her friends were watching with the particular alertness of people waiting to see what happens next. I like to dress for myself, I said. Habit I picked up before I learned whose last name I was borrowing. Her face went very still. Garrett materialized at our side. I have never been able to figure out if she called him with some signal I couldn't see, or if he simply had a lifelong reflex to appear when she needed shielding. He put his hand on my arm, not gently. Serena, he said. A warning. I'm just having a conversation. You're embarrassing the family. I'm standing at a bar drinking water. I haven't said anything embarrassing. You wore that dress. I looked at him. 3 years of watching the man I loved get quietly, incrementally dimmed, and he was standing here telling me my dress was the problem. I set my glass down on the bar. Garrett. My voice was even. I had practiced being even for a long time. I need you to think about something. When did you last make a decision? Any decision that your mother didn't have a hand in? What you eat in the morning? What doctor you see? What supplements you take? When did you last choose something because you wanted to and not because she'd arranged the options before you got there? His hand dropped from my arm. Irene stepped forward. There was a quality to the way she moved in that moment, precise and purposeful, like she had been waiting for an opening. And she put 2 fingers on my shoulder and turned me toward her. It was not a gentle touch. It was the kind of touch that says, I am redirecting you, and you do not have a say in that. You don't speak to my son that way in front of guests, she said, quiet. Steele. Take your hand off me. She didn't. What happened next happened in approximately 4 seconds. Garrett, perhaps reacting to something in my tone, perhaps to something in hers, stepped forward and said stop. But the word came out wrong, too late and too stiff. And Irene's hand tightened on my shoulder, and I stepped back and she stepped with me. And then her other hand came up. She slapped me, not Garrett, her. It was not hard, it was precise. An open palm, angled, the kind of slap designed not to hurt but to humiliate, to make me flinch in front of 200 people and understand, in the most physical way possible, where I stood in the hierarchy of this family. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something has happened that no one is sure how to name. I felt my cheek. I felt the heat. I looked at Irene's face, which was composed and satisfied and waiting for me to cry. I didn't cry. What I did, and I have thought about this moment many times since, whether I chose it or whether it came from somewhere too old and too deep to call a choice, was laugh. Not loudly, not wildly, a quiet, short laugh, almost to myself, like someone who has just gotten to the last page of a book and found that the ending was exactly what they expected. Then I reached into my evening bag, took out my phone, and sent a text. The text said, "Now." There were 3 words Pollard and I had discussed. Now was one of them. I put the phone back in my bag. I smoothed the front of my dress. The room was still silent, still watching, and I looked at Irene with her hand still raised slightly, as if she wasn't quite done, and I said, "Thank you." "I was starting to think you'd make it through the whole night." She stared at me. Garrett said my name. "I'm fine," I said. "I've been fine. I've actually been building toward fine for about 6 months. It took 11 minutes. I know because I counted them. 11 minutes of standing in that room while the band started up again uncertainly and the guests around us began the performed return to normalcy. Reaching for glasses, turning to companions, pretending they hadn't seen. Irene went to speak to her husband. Garrett came to stand beside me, close, not touching, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "The supplements," he said finally. "Yes. How long have you known?" "Since May." He was quiet for a very long time. Long enough that I started to understand what it felt like to wait for someone to choose. Long enough that I felt the weight of what it meant that I had stayed and built a case instead of leaving, and what it meant that he had taken whatever his mother put in front of him every morning without asking why. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't. I didn't feel like myself. I thought it was work. I thought it was us." It wasn't us. 2 men entered through the main doors of the ballroom with the particular quality of stillness that law enforcement carries in spaces like this. Too calm, too deliberate, too unimpressed by the floral arrangements. Behind them, a woman in a dark blazer who I recognized as the supervising attorney from the SEC's New York regional office. She had a folder under her arm and an expression that had never once in its life been charmed by a party. Irene saw them before they reached her husband. I watched it happen, watched her face process their presence, watched her calculate, watched her land on the wrong answer. She turned to one of their attorneys, a guest, started speaking in a low voice. Garrett's father stood up. One of the agents spoke to him in a tone I couldn't hear from where I stood. He sat back down. I watched Garrett watch this. I watched him put together what it meant. I watched something shift in him. Not relief, not anger. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a man standing up after a very long time on his knees. He reached over and took my hand. I let him. Irene was escorted from the room 15 minutes later, composed and furious and already planning her calls, I was sure. The SEC's review of the Whitmore Group's fund management practices would take several months, result in a formal enforcement action, and generate more column inches in the financial press than anything the family had managed in 3 generations. The physician lost his license. The supplement protocol was discontinued. Garrett checked himself into a proper medical facility the following week. He had a physician of his own choosing this time, a woman who ran a practice out of a small office in Brooklyn that his mother had never heard of. The process was slow. Recovery is always slower than you think it will be when you're standing at the beginning of it. We did not pretend that the previous 3 years were nothing. We sat in therapy together twice a week for months in a room where I said out loud all the things I had stored in shoeboxes, and he listened in the way that people listen when they are trying to figure out who they are without the version of themselves that someone else built for them. It was not easy. There were sessions I left feeling like I'd been turned inside out. There were nights I wasn't sure the math of staying added up. But I had done 6 months of surveillance in a marriage I believed in, and that was not nothing. I had stayed not because I was afraid to go, but because I believed there was a man underneath the thing being done to him who deserved someone to fight for the truth before writing him off. I wanted to be the kind of person who checked first. I still wear the navy dress. I wore it to the SEC's public hearing. I wore it to the dinner Garrett took me to on our anniversary last year, at a restaurant he chose himself, at a table he booked himself, with a card he wrote in his own handwriting that said nothing about the family, just my name and his, in one sentence. I'm sorry it took so long to find the light switch. He found it. That's the part that matters. Those Monday flower deliveries stopped, of course. The shoebox is still under the bed. I keep meaning to throw it out, but every time I reach for it, I think about the woman who stood in a ballroom with a handprint on her cheek and a text message sending. And I think she earned the right to keep her receipts. I still think about what Irene's face looked like in the moment before she understood what was happening. Not after. Before. That split second where she was still certain she had won, still reading my quiet as surrender. That expression is what I come back to when people ask me why I didn't leave sooner. Why I spent 6 months building something instead of just walking out the door. The honest answer is that leaving would have been easier. And easier wasn't what the situation deserved. There's something I've come to believe about the way consequences actually work, not the way we wish they worked, where bad behavior gets punished instantly and the right people suffer visibly and everything resolves in a single dramatic moment. Real consequences are slower and more patient than that. They accumulate in direct proportion to what people choose to do when they think no one is keeping track. Irene spent decades cultivating an environment where the rules applied to everyone except her family. She was meticulous about it. She was also, ultimately, undone by it. Because that same meticulousness created a paper trail I had 18 months to study. What I built during those 6 months wasn't just a legal case. It was a commitment to a version of myself I wasn't willing to abandon. I could have acted out of anger. There was enough of it. I could have made accusations without evidence, detonated things publicly, let the fury drive. It would have felt good for about 48 hours, and then I would have been the unstable wife with nothing to show for it. Instead, I made myself sit with what I knew, think clearly about what I could prove, and act only when I had something solid enough to stand on. That kind of discipline, choosing to be rigorous when everything in you wants to be reactive, is one of the harder things I've ever done. It didn't come naturally. I had to practice it like a skill. Garrett had to do his own version of it. Recovering your own judgment after someone has been methodically eroding it is not a quick process. There were weeks where I watched him second-guess every small preference, every opinion, reaching for a confidence that his mother had been quietly dismantling for years. He did it anyway. He showed up to every session, asked the hard questions about himself, sat with answers that weren't comfortable. That took a different kind of strength than mine. Not strategy, but persistence. The willingness to keep going on days when the light at the end felt entirely theoretical. I think about the shoebox sometimes. All those cards in her handwriting, all those weeks of small diminishments. She thought she was building a record of her authority. I was building something else entirely. There's a version of integrity that isn't loud or obvious. It's just the daily decision to act in a way you can account for later, even when no one is watching, even when the easier path is right there. Serena 6 months ago made that choice in a coffee shop near Penn Station, slid a folder across the table, and trusted that doing the right thing carefully was worth more than doing the reactive thing immediately. She was right. I know that now in a way that isn't abstract anymore. The navy dress is still in my closet. I wore it to the hearing. I'll probably wear it again someday when I need to remember what it feels like to walk into a room having already done the work.